I think where we sit today with developing a constitution is something I've heard all my life. You know, as a young person going to assemblies, and regardless of how people said it, it was always, when are we going to design that government? When are we going to make our own laws? You know, there was so many different ways that people said it. And now when I look back, and of course, before we started this process, we pulled out all of those resolutions from past assemblies. And sometimes it was, get out of the Societies Act. We need to be our own government. It was, when are we going to have a constitution? When are we going to quit living under the government's thumb? You know, there was so much said in so many different ways, but I think it all came back to me. It all came back as what our people have been saying forever, maybe way back to 1816, when they first flew that first flag of saying, we are a nation. We will look after our own. We will design our government. We will do all of those kinds of things way back then. It's like we've now just fast forwarded it to where we're actually doing it. And that to me, yeah, you could probably say, for me, is the ultimate, because I believe it's going to be something we can truly leave behind for my children, my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and all those generations to follow. It'll be just building on what so many past leaders did to bring us to this point.
Direct trade between Indigenous people and Europeans began in Alberta in the 1770s on the shores of Lake Athabasca. The Métis were originally a product of the fur trade. They are descendants of early unions between European explorers and fur traders and First Nations women. Within a few generations, the descendants of these unions developed a culture distinct from their European and First Nation forebears. The Métis Nation was born. The Métis Nation homeland includes all of what is now Alberta.
Our history is couple of centuries old. It didn't just happen. We didn't just pop up out of nowhere and said, oh, we want to be a people. We are a people. And it was evolved, and evolved as a nation, as a culture, as a people with language, spirituality, religions, music and dance, food, all the economies, all the kind of things that make a people, make a country, make a community. So that's who we are. We evolved and we lived on this land. We belong to this land. This land belongs to us. So yeah, that's how you evolve. It didn't just start with getting organized. We were a family unit. We're a community unit, and putting structure to it and governance to that was in reaction to response to the governments that were invading this country, you know.
In 1860, the colonial authorities in the Red River attempt to restrict the trade in pemmican. In response, a group of Métis, led by Cuthbert Grant, capture Fort Brandon, a Hudson Bay Company post. It's a victory to the Métis that cements their status as an independent nation. Known to Canadians as the Battle of Seven Oaks, it is remembered by the Métis as the Battle of Frog Plain.
Self-government for the Métis Nation of Alberta is so important because we would be able to govern ourselves, and we want to go nation to nation, government to government. It is very important for us right now, as you are aware, the Métis Nation of Alberta is under the Societies Act, and we went under that Societies Act to govern ourselves, right? To be a governing body. And we are looking at having a constitution, because if you have a constitution, then definitely we can be a government who will work for the citizens of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And I believe that it has come to the time where we as a people need to say, we know who we are, we know the needs across the province of Alberta. We know that our people struggle with education, with housing, you know. There's social and economic issues out there, but who better than a Métis person that lives in those communities that could tell you what is going on.
M&A has always been a government. It has been a government since it was kind of more formally organized in about 1928, at which point it called itself something different. It called itself l'Association Métis de l'Alberta et des Territoires des Nord-Ouest. It then kind of reorganized itself in 1931 and started calling itself the Métis Association of Alberta. And at that point, it was doing the work that Métis in Alberta needed it to do as a government that answered only to that population's needs. But it was very limited too, because it was organized in the eyes of Canada, or in the eyes of the province, informally. It had no legal, independent identity in Canadian law. In the early 1960s, in 1961, under the leadership of Adrian Hope, it was formally incorporated as a society under Alberta Societies Act. And really, they did that so that it could have a bank account and so that it could receive funds from outside sources and begin to serve Alberta Métis better. But the consequence is that the kind of legal and administrative arm of the MNA became a nonprofit society. And that proliferated. So now the MNA's provincial council is a society under the Societies Act. Every one of its regions are separate societies under the Societies Act, and every one of the locals are separate societies under the Societies Act. And not only is a society not the best legal vehicle to be a real government, but having kind of an unwieldy number of interconnected societies makes it very difficult for the MNA to play the role as government and answer its citizens' needs in a way that its citizens really deserve. So the answer is yes, the MNA has always been a government from the Métis perspective. The difference is now the MNA will also be a government from Canada's perspective, and that will allow the MNA really to better serve its people.
Well, I think it formalizes that nation-to-nation sort of relationship between the two. In many ways, you know, we've always asserted that that's the case, but I think it just sort of makes it a little bit more formal. The process, I think, for all nations is there's that declaration, and this is another way to sort of make that declaration. And then I think the Government of Canada can respond and accept that declaration.
In 1849, Pierre Guillaume Seyeur, a Métis man, is charged with illegally trading furs in Rupert's Land. As his trial is held, a large group of Métis surround the courthouse. Though Seyeur is convicted, he is not punished. The assembled crowd celebrates, chanting as a rallying cry, "Le commerce est libre." And as a result, the Hudson Bay Company effectively loses the ability to use the courts to enforce its supposed trade monopoly.
You can go back to the 1830s, 1820s. We were here already as Métis people, you know, and we were slowly establishing ourselves, but we understood this land. We understood this was such a beautiful area for Métis, and you know, the Métis loved this hill. They could see out, and it was in close proximity to the Edmonton as well, you know, to the fur trading center. You know, and from here they would go to the north into Lesser Slave Lake, into Athabasca country, you know, up into McMurray. You know, it was very much a community hub and very much a Métis settlement.
In 1869 and 1870, Canada begins to expand into the Métis Nation homeland. The Hudson Bay Company transfers Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory, which includes present-day Alberta, to the newly created Dominion of Canada. Concerned that Canada will not respect their rights and freedoms, the Métis resist. Under the leadership of Louis Riel, the Métis established their own provisional government in the Red River region. The Métis negotiate a treaty with Canada, parts of which become enshrined in the Manitoba Act of 1870, and the province of Manitoba is created. The Métis are promised, among other things, 1.4 million acres of land for their children. But the Crown fails to fulfill. this promise honorably.
There's a Cree word that we use here in Alberta to describe ourselves. It's otipimsuak, and that really is, to me, is the core, is the fundamental value that we really do govern ourselves. We value liberty, we value tradition, we value respect for one another, and our ability to continue the practices that we have for generations have enjoyed. The connection to the land is also so very important. So going through the process of providing that opportunity for, again, for just reflecting what's in our Constitution at the end of the day is so very important.
In 1885, in the face of Canada's failure to fulfill its promises to the Métis, or to respect our rights, the Métis established the provincial government of Saskatchewan under the leadership of Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont. Canada crushes the Métis government in what is remembered as the Battle of Batoche. Louis Riel is captured, and later, he is executed.
You know, what does governance mean? It means the world to me. You know, land, people, family, commitment, hard work, you know, justice, taking care of family, children, you know, everything. We had self-governance a long time ago. It means the world to my relatives. It means the world to me that maybe one day they'll honor that scrip that was taken from us, or not granted to us. You know, maybe that will come to fruition. It's really hard as a community to go back and ask for these things, but we're stronger as a nation.
Beginning in 1885, Canada offers scrip, that is a coupon to be traded for land or money, to Métis residing in the Northwest Territories, including present-day Alberta. The scrip system was rife with fraud and abuse. The bulk of the scrip ended up in the hands of land speculators, and the Métis received next to nothing for it. The Supreme Court of Canada has said that the history of scrip speculation and devaluation is a sorry chapter in our nation's history.
We know as Canadians almost nothing about scrip. What we learn about as the general Canadian population, what we learn about Métis, ends with Louis Riel and the Red River. If we even get to Batoche, then we've had an extensive education. But the fallout and the legacy of all that, the next chapter in it, is scrip. So it goes like this. Canada's a young country, and their ambitions are looking west. And there's a provision in the original Constitution that says that a further deal can be made with the Hudson's Bay Company to transfer Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territories, which is a huge amount of land, which is all of the land that drains into the Hudson's Bay and the Arctic Ocean. And as soon as Canada becomes a country, John A. Macdonald puts his mind to this because they want to link the then colony of British Columbia to the new Canada. They strike a deal between England, the Hudson's Bay Company, and Canada to make the transfer. The times being what they were, they never talked to the people living in the territory about it. They never talked to the Indigenous people in the Northwestern Territories. And overwhelmingly, the biggest population center at the time is Red River. And overwhelmingly, the people in Red River are Métis. So the Métis, quite rightly, it turns out, are very concerned that the new government won't protect their rights to the land, won't respect them as Indigenous people in the territory. And as you know, Louis Riel declares the provisional government, and that becomes the Red River Resistance, and eventually they negotiate terms of union. Those terms of union set aside 1.4 million acres of land to the Métis children in southern Manitoba, in what we call the postage stamp, but it's really the Red and Assiniboine River area. That land was never really given to the Métis children. In great Canadian fashion, the new government ragged the puck on delivering the land, didn't really deliver the land, did at one point, and then took it all back and recounted it and redistributed it, and came up with a system for fulfilling the promise on paper but not in practice. And that system was scrip. They ended up issuing what was called a subscription certificate. scrip for short, which is a piece of paper, a coupon, but overwhelmingly, these coupons were not redeemed in Manitoba. And largely the Métis were dispossessed in that part of the country. There was a military reign of terror, and a lot of them fled to other parts of the Northwestern Territories. That, though, was not the only promise that was made to the Métis at Confederation and when the Northwestern Territories joined the Union. There was another promise, a promise that this larger territory, which became eventually the Prairie Provinces and the Northwestern Territories, but wasn't at the time, would be transferred to Canada on the condition that Canada settled the claims of the Indigenous people living there equitably. And right from the beginning, there was acknowledgement that there was two groups of Indigenous people living in this part of the world. There were First Nations, or Indians as they called them at the time, and there were Métis, or half-breeds, using the language of the time. And they dealt with the First Nations more or less right away, although depending on where you are, it went into the 1900s. And they did that using treaty. At first, they never addressed the Métis claims. It wasn't until the end of the Northwest Resistance, Batoche, the execution of Riel, that this became a really live issue in the Canadian consciousness. People realized that the Métis claims couldn't be ignored and something had to be done about it. They struck commissions, scrip commissions, to go out and issue scrip to Métis to resolve their claim to the land as Indigenous people, to resolve their Indian title as Métis, using the language of the day. There were all kinds of problems with this process. It took years, for one. Another issue, and this is particularly true in Northern Alberta and Treaty 8 territory, which is why I took the example, was that overwhelmingly the places that Métis people were living on the prairies are not places that were being surveyed for settlement. Métis tended to live in the parkland, in the boreal forest, in the northern, at least in Saskatchewan and Alberta, in the northern parts of the province. And the land that was being surveyed for settlement immediately was in the southern plains, because it was easy to open up for farming. So if a Métis person did want to locate their coupon and take their land, they would have had to dislocate themselves from their homeland, move themselves to a different part of the world. People didn't want to do that. Even the bureaucratic process itself was hard. There were no Dominion Lands offices in Northern Alberta until about the 1910s, and the Scrip Commission went through in 1899. So you'd have to wait 10 years before there was an office in your area. Or you'd have to travel a huge distance, the thousands of kilometers to Edmonton, Calgary, Moose Jaw, one of the places where there were Dominion Lands offices. So all of this combined to make scrip something that was very cumbersome for Métis people to redeem for land as it was intended. Colonists, however, had a solution, and that was that the commissions themselves were accompanied by speculators. They traveled together. They were on the same boats. Some of these speculators were privately financed and some weren't. A lot of them were financed by big banks. And they would wait immediately outside of the tent where scrip was being issued and right away offered to buy the original receipt off a claimant for pennies on the dollar. So scrip was issued in increments of 160, 240 acres or 160 and $240. And for 10 cents on the dollar, for a sum of something like $30, a speculator would purchase scrip worth $240 or 240 acres. And then they would go through the process of eventually redeeming it. The Métis person had some money, and that was it. That was really their whole inheritance. Think about that. That's everything that Métis people inherited in law in terms of their Indigenous and Aboriginal rights. Eventually they were given $30 for and told it was all gone. It was all extinguished.
In 1896, Father Lacombe, with the backing of the federal government, establishes a reserve and school for the Métis who were left destitute after taking scrip. Within less than a decade, however, the school is closed and the lands are taken over by French-Canadian settlers, and the Métis are forced to relocate.
We were already here, early in the 1800s, just before mid-1800s. And we were growing and growing. And there was the provision that we were promised scrip land coming off the Sturgeon River, which is just behind the picture here. But that never happened. And back in 1894, there was community members that were starting to organize themselves and meet. And then in 1896, they formed the St. Albert Métis Association to take on that one sole political issue of reclaiming land that belonged to the Métis here.
Well, in Alberta, it started before the 30s. So in the 30s, and of course it was before that, when people were struggling. We were being invaded. This area was being invaded by Europeans, and eventually our folks thought, well, Jesus, we better start trying to maybe catch up here and maybe apply the European way of doing things. So they got organized again. And if you were to check the history, it wouldn't be the first time they'd organized all through Canada, back in the before Batoche and before the provisional government that was written by Louis Riel. They were organized in the buffalo hunts, where there was all structure and rules even then. So it would have made sense that when they're in Alberta, they felt they better get organized, because it looked like this government was ruling over our peoples, and it's time to us to find a place again. And that was where they created an association, the Half-Breed Association. And it says that there in the document, and eventually became the Métis Association.
And this idea of independence, of self-determination, is just part and parcel of the Métis identity, particularly in Alberta. So you can't have that if you are always being governed by somebody else. More to the point, what it was to be Métis in Alberta from very early on was to be part of these initiatives to organize around issues that concerned the community. Be it in Slave Lake, or St. Albert is a great example. I think by the 1880s, 1890s, there was a Métis Association in St. Albert that was very formally organized and really was designed to assist and answer the needs of the community. This happened in Fishing Lake. This happened really in a number of very important Métis communities across the province. So I see self-government as one, being the best way for Métis families and Métis communities to answer their own needs that have been overlooked and ignored by provincial and federal governments for generations, but also a way to reclaim identity. This idea of working together for collective self-determination really is part and parcel of what it has always meant to be Métis in Alberta.
The Métis Famous Five: Malcolm Norris, Jim Brady, Peter Tompkins, Joseph Dion, and Felix Calou formed the Métis Association of Alberta, which would later become the Métis Nation of Alberta. The association was a response to the poor living conditions of Métis Albertans since the late 1800s, especially after Louis Riel's execution in 1885. The Famous Five went on to pressure the government of Alberta on behalf of the Métis population for a protected homeland, the Métis settlements. As a result of their lobbying efforts, the Alberta legislature created the Ewing Commission in 1934 to investigate the living conditions of Métis in Alberta. The Commission's report called for the provincial government to provide a Métis land base, and in 1938, Alberta became the first and only province in Canada to recognize and protect Métis settlements under provincial legislation.
And today we now have the Métis Nation of Alberta. That generation saw the future for us, the Famous Five. Well, they were the ones that formed and came together and formed the alliance of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and that's where this grew out of. But that's only the political arm of the Métis communities. We were here long before that.
We need to look 50 years down the road, because if it's any indication as to the very foundation of your Constitution, like your home, you can't just go and rattle and shake your foundation. You'll fall up, your building will fall apart. Foundation in our Constitution for the self-government on a go-forward basis needs to have such strength that it may only need some change 30 years down the road. So we have to be very conscious and cognizant of what we put into that foundation, because it's all been about nation building.
Métis serve in the Second World War, fighting for Canada. While overseas, they experience being treated as equals and are exposed to emerging international concepts of human rights and self-determination. Indigenous mobilization continued in the 1960s. In keeping with an international trend towards decolonization and self-determination following the Second World War, Indigenous people across North America mobilized in defense of their rights. In Canada, the Métis Nation is at the forefront of the movement. In 1961, under the leadership of Adrian Hope, the Métis Association of Alberta formally registers as an association under provincial legislation, giving the MAA access to federal funding, and the organization is revitalized. In 1982, after intense consultations, the Premier of Alberta, Peter Lougheed, proposes the final wording for what would become Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. The existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. Aboriginal peoples of Canada is defined to explicitly include the Métis.
The relationship that the MNA has right now that is put it onto the path to self-government is with the federal government. So, and I should say, the MNA doesn't become a government the moment the Constitution is ratified. That's a hugely important step. Once the Constitution is ratified, there are a few other things that need to fall into place. A financing agreement for the new government. There's federal legislation that needs to pass, which we're hoping will pass kind of before or at the same time as the Constitution. Once all those pieces are lined up, then the MNA becomes a government. So the MNA becomes a government. In my view, it will radically change the relationship with the province. The province now, when it is convenient, takes the position that the MNA is only a society and that it can only perform the tasks of a society, that it is private and only represents its members and doesn't engage with the MNA the way that it engages with First Nations bands that are recognized under the Indian Act or with the Métis settlements that are recognized under provincial legislation. Being recognized as a government under federal legislation ought to give the MNA a whole new level of standing in how it interacts with and is treated by the provincial government in order to achieve other milestones like better recognition of harvesting rights, recognition of the duty to consult, and how to operationalize the duty to consult.
In 1991, the MAA changes its name, officially becoming the Métis Nation of Alberta. The name change is an unambiguous assertion of Métis nationhood. It also clearly signals the kind of relationship the Métis Nation of Alberta intends to establish with the federal and provincial governments, nation to nation, government to government. Over the last 20 years, the leadership of the Métis Nation has had a number of landmark Supreme Court rulings that continue to affirm their right to self-determination and self-government. And on June 27, 2019, after more than 90 years of perseverance and struggle, the Métis Nation of Alberta, along with the Métis Nation of Ontario and the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, signed the Métis Government Recognition and Self-Government Agreement, or the MGRSAs, the first ever self-government agreement between the Government of Canada and a Métis government. The MGRSA explicitly recognizes the Métis Nation within Alberta as having inherent and constitutionally protected right to self-government. It also creates a process by which the MNA will be recognized as an Indigenous government in federal legislation.
We already have the recognition from the federal government that we are the Métis Nation within Alberta. There's more work to do. We're working on a fiscal financial arrangement. We're working on a transition plan of exactly that. How will the government relate to us as a government rather than where we have been in the past. So there's a lot of work to do, but I believe that we've already got that recognition. There will be legislation that will clearly, not what the government tells us we should do, but the legislation how we want to be accepted and looked upon and worked with. As Métis people, we in Alberta here, we always try to find ways to work with all governments because it's important. We have a really good working relationship with municipal governments, and we've had on and off with the provincial government, and now with the relationship with the federal government, I believe we're well on our way to truly getting that recognition from all levels of government.
Yes, I truly believe we need to remember our elders because they paved the way for us, but I think it's time for us to bring the youth in because they are the future leaders. And I think with the Constitution, we can do that much better than where we're at now. I want the youth to be involved, and I want the youth to have an understanding of the government of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And I think if we can teach them who we are, who we were, where we have been, where we are going, we'll keep them in. And I think it's very important for the youth to understand that our language, our dance, our food makes us a distinct nation. The Métis, we have our Michif language. I speak Michif and I speak Cree. I always say this about our language. It is the essence of who we are. You need to keep the language for the identity for us.
So Métis youth have been involved in politics for a really long time. I think a lot of people forget that a lot of our early leaders were youth. Louis Riel was like 25 years old during the 1869-1870 resistance. James Brady was around 20 years old when the Métis Nation of Alberta was first formed in 1928. Malcolm Norris was 28 during that time as well. Cuthbert Grant was in his early 20s during the Battle of Seven Oaks. So we don't look back and say these were youth leaders. We look back and say these were just leaders. These were the people who built our nation and created what we now have today. So while yes, youth are our future and youth contemporarily are getting involved and taking charge, this isn't new. It's not a new thing for Métis youth to be, leading the charge with whatever the situation is.
I am very thankful that I've had the opportunity to be in leadership this long. It's 24 years in September that I've been the president, and I've been able to see and support a lot of the things that our communities have wanted, to move forward. And I know I will be the happiest person alive if we get to the point where we do have, over the next 2 years, we do have a constitution that is in place, because that is a dream not only that I've heard reiterated time after time at assemblies, but so many of our elderly people are so pleased that we're really moving in that area. So to me, that'll be a huge step in the next level of governance that our young people will take on.